Hey everybody, Trisha here with Sewing Parts Online. In today's episode, I'm going to show you how to sew the infamous French seam. So what's the French seam? It's a specific seam finish where two seams are sewn, one narrow one and one larger one. By doing this, the raw edges are completely encased. It's one of those finishes that give your project such nice results that if you show somebody, they look at it and go, "You made that?" Yes, I did. It can look intimidating, but don't worry. It's actually quite easy once you get the system down. We are so used to placing our fabric right sides together, right? When doing a French seam, you actually start off doing the opposite. Make sure that you put wrong sides together. Honestly, that's probably the biggest source of confusion with doing a French seam. This one on the left is as if your pattern called for a 3/8 inch seam allowance, whereas this one is if your pattern called for 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to show you how to sew both. Match up this edge. Stick a couple of pins in there. Let's sew some French seams. The first one that I'm going to show you is as if your pattern called for a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Begin by sewing a 1/8 inch seam allowance. When I have my needle in center needle position, I've got markings on my plate, and I also have a reference point on my foot that I can look at while I sew that 1/8 inch. My fabric got a little bit wonky there. We can just even it out. Now let's scooch over to the pressing board and open up that seam. It's pretty narrow, so it may take you a second to get that open. You can either iron or finger press it. Take our right side up and then flip this over. So now pretty sides are together. And you just want to get that stitched line nice and straight. Use your fingers to roll it a little bit. That just makes it a lot easier to sew the next seam allowance. When doing my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I prefer to use the edge of my foot as a guide. If I leave my needle in center needle position, that's not going to be the correct distance. For the settings on my machine, if I move my stitch width, my needle position to an 8.5, that will allow me to use the right side of the foot and I'll get a perfect 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to scooch my stitch width to an 8.5. This is going to vary depending on the foot you're using in your machine. So I would recommend testing out those distances before you're actually doing a project and not just taking the number that I'm giving you. Again, I'm just going to be lining the fabric up with the edge of the foot. This way I don't have to look at the plate. I can just keep an eye on the guide on my foot and I am good. Let's head back to the pressing board. All right, we've got our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we can open it up and you can just choose a side to press it to. And I also like to give a press on the front. Pretty on the front, pretty on the back. If at any point in this video you've learned something, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button. Now let's move on to the French seam as if your pattern called for a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So the first seam allowance is going to be a 1/4 inch. I've left my needle in the same position and I'll be using the right side of my foot as my guide. Where do you plan on applying the French seam? Comment below, I'd love to hear your idea. The French seam is ideal for light to medium weight fabric. That doesn't mean you can't use it with heavier fabric, it's just that you're going to see some bulk. A great option with the light to medium. If you are using a heavier fabric, I would recommend trimming that first seam allowance just to eliminate some of the bulk. Let's scooch back over to the pressing board and get that pressed open. All right, we've got our 1/4 inch stitched. Now we can open this up. If you want to eliminate some bulk, you can trim this down to 1/2. That's perfectly fine. But our next seam allowance is going to be 3/8, so it will encase this. So I am simply going to finger press this open to help with our next step. Remember, right sides together. Make sure that fold is nice and crisp. Let's go finish up. Our first seam allowance was 1/4 inch. Now, because we need it to equal 5/8 of an inch, we will be stitching a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Again, I want to use the right side of my foot, but if I leave my needle as is, it would be incorrect. I need to move my stitch width to 5.0. That's going to give me a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch from the needle to the side of my foot. And here we go again. I just think this seam finish is so pretty. Looks so professional, nice and neat, no fraying. Love it. Last press. I hope that this is giving you the confidence to get out there and do some French seams. Until next time.